welcome back. I'm here, Wesley Shantz, with Signum Academy. All of the Twitch streaming is working, it looks like, and I've got my headset on so you can hear me better, I hope. It's not too loud, not too quiet, but just right. And we're still in The Light Beyond the Forest, The Quest for the Holy Grail by Rosemary Sutcliff. So I've got my book here. I'm going to just borrow it again. It gets returned after just an hour, so I've been borrowing it over and over today and the past few days as I've been rereading it for today. I guess where I last left off must be this chapter, at least with this browser. Okay, but let's go back to the start. I was looking up some interesting things about each of our main characters today. And so I think that's why I was in Gawaine's chapter, because Gawaine is really funny to me. He's one of my favorites. I think we talked about her note last time, and I think we talked about the sword a little bit, but I don't think that we actually got to discuss much about the way that this story begins. It actually begins. Oh, there I am. Okay, sorry, I was looking to see if the chat's there. Yeah, okay. It actually begins with the town of Camelot, the castle and the town. And the way that it's described is striking. It climbs up the hillside. Of course, Camelot is a imaginary place. There's plenty of contenders for the historical location that it might be based on, but it's evoked in a very concrete way here, as if it's covering the side of the hill. And then at the foot of the hill, the river cast its shining silver noose. And at the highest heart of the town rose the palace of King Arthur. So we have this noose of the river, this curve in the river, and then at the top, the heart of the town is the palace of King Arthur. And it just strikes me that although we're getting the town described, and that river will be important, because of course the rock with the sword in it comes floating down, the block of marble with the sword. Arthur is hardly present in this story at all. And that may be kind of indicative of the entire Arthurian story. He's not the most impressive character in the story. What he is, though, of course, is presiding over the round table. And here's what Rosemary Sutcliff says about that. The Knights of the Fellowship of the Round Table, which had been formed long ago when Arthur was new and young to his kingship, for the spreading of justice and mercy and chivalry and the upholding of right against might throughout the land. The idea of this order of knights and this idea of justice is what Arthur represents. So it's not him on his own that really matters. It's what he stands for. What he presides over is the great organized body of chivalry. And of course, the most impressive of all the knights, at least so far, has been Lancelot. And so when the adventure comes this Pentecost, it's for Lancelot that the damsel is calling. Now, as we said, Arthur hardly appears in this story at all. He's really just in this first chapter, and he's really just a kind of person for Lancelot to discuss things with. When Lancelot goes on this adventure, it turns out that this has to do with his son, Galahad, and of course, the person that Lancelot really loves is Arthur's queen, Guinevere, as she spells it. However, his son Galahad comes from another woman called Elaine, and when he looks at Galahad, he can see the resemblance between himself and Elaine in this child. Now, this causes him some distress. Not only is Galahad a sort of symbol of Lancelot's failings, things he hasn't been able to do that he might have wanted to do. It turns out that Galahad, as we'll see very shortly here, is proved the greatest knight in the world. That's this stone with the sword in it. So it's a kind of echo of the sword in the stone. But this time, not only is he greater than Arthur, as we know lots of knights are greater than Arthur, that's not that special, but he's even greater than Lancelot, who's always been the top of the ranking among the knights of the Round Table. And Lancelot knows this from the very beginning. He can tell that this sword is not for him. It's not meant for him. Same goes for the seat at the table that has always been empty, the so-called perilous or dangerous seat. This is where Galahad's name is going to appear, and there's this kind of moment when that appearance is connected to the time period being a certain number of years since the story of the Grail begins. So all of this is kind of wrapped in around Galahad. The most important seat at the Round Table, the sword and the stone that proves he's the greatest knight. So he's taking Lancelot's place. He's taking Arthur's place in a way. He's kind of undoing the Round Table with his arrival. All the knights are going to set off on this quest for the Grail. And he's even connected to the Christian story that's in the background of the Holy Grail. So he seems pretty important. Maybe we should talk a little bit more about Galahad then. This story of the kind of the rankings and the whole system of the knights being kind of overturned, of course, revolves around Galahad, but also the search for the Holy Grail. He arrives, and as soon as he does, so does the Grail. And the different responses to this, I think, are pretty interesting. I think we should note here the title of the book before we move too far away. It comes in here. For a long while they had felt, the older knights especially, that at Camelot the high and shining days were over. The long struggle for right against might, there's that phrase again, was behind them, and the dreams were done with, and life had settled into a solid mold, and there was a weariness of heart among the fellowship of the Round Table. Now there was something ahead of them again, instead of all in the past. Something coming. Joy or grief, maybe death, but something coming. A light beyond the forest, thought Sir Lancelot, but the dark forest to be traversed first, and was not quite sure why he had thought it. If I were a tree and spring was coming, a long way off but still coming, this is how I should feel, thought Sir Percival. And his wide serious gaze was on the young knight, who sat so gravely and calmly in the forbidden seat. So there's three important knights that the story kind of moves between. There's Galahad, there's Percival, who is kind of like second or third in the rankings, usually after Lancelot. And then there's Sir Bors, who we'll kind of come to later. And the story pretty much moves between those. Lancelot as well, Gawain for a chapter here and there. But you notice the huge difference. We don't have much of the interior of Galahad, but the difference between the thoughts of Lancelot and the thoughts of Percival. Of course, Arthur's thoughts are, oh man, oh no, the round table is broken, right? They're scattering after the Grail. That's what we get in chapter 2. But here we get this feeling of joy and grief and maybe death, but something anyway, this anticipation that all the knights can feel. And it comes at them really differently. For Lancelot, he says it's a dark forest to be traversed. Right? So this is just another quest for him to overcome. But it's something beyond, right? The light beyond the forest. And Lancelot is fated not to arrive truly to the end of the quest. Whereas instead of the dark forest, Percival imagines himself being a tree, and spring is coming. And I don't know about where you are, but here you can really feel that. It's bright and sunny lately. Still cool, but you can feel the spring coming. You can see the buds on the trees, and the grass starting to pop up, and the flowers starting to come out of their hibernation. And so Percival has this really positive outlook. And I think we do see Percival kind of connected with hope throughout the story. And I'll see a little bit of that. Okay, so we get a little bit of the background about the Holy Grail there, about King Pelles, that's Galahad's grandfather, and then we hear about the wasteland here. And this again has to do with Galahad's birth. He'd been born in the castle of Corbinic, bred there through his first years. His grandsire was King Pelles, so he knew well enough where the Grail was lodged. Sir Lancelot knew it too, but they knew also, as did every knight setting out from Arthur's court that morning, that simply to ride to Corbinic and beat upon the castle gate, demanding to see the mystery within, would serve but an empty purpose. They must cast themselves on fate. And so we read this a bit last time too, I think. The idea here being Galahad is born for this, and Lancelot's his father, so Lancelot is involved in this fate or providence, but he's not going to be the one who actually achieves the quest. He knows where the Grail is. He is in some way responsible for Galahad being able to get there, but it's not as simple as showing up and demanding to see the mystery. This is kind of the difficult thing about the Holy Grail, at least for Lancelot. The idea that he can't confront this quest head on, which is sort of his MO. And you see this especially in the Monty Python and the Holy Grail movie. It's pretty hilarious. Lancelot just charges in. Of course, that's not going to work this time. And Lancelot's greatness, in a way, is always what gets him in trouble. That's another kind of difficulty. Whereas for Galahad, this again is really not a big deal. He is, I think, our representative of faith, really, in the story. At least that's one way to understand it, because he's associated with the cross and the shield. He is associated with the sword of destiny, right? This idea that you can trust in events to work out. So in that way, I think he represents faith, sort of the way that Percival is like representing hope. And of course, that leaves the third being charity or love, who, oddly enough, I think it must be Bors. And we don't really hear that much about Bors in other parts of the story. He does appear now and then, though, and he's important. We'll see him play an important role here, and I think before the third book is over, we'll see some important things about Bors as well. If I'm remembering right, he'll be there at the very end of that story too. So Bors, we'll see why I think he might be a representative of love, but that's kind of flattening out what each of these characters might represent. Um, in in that discussion of Pelleas and the wasteland, I think we hear more about it. Sorry, I think maybe it's another few pages ahead here. I wanted to mention this. I don't know where it is. I'm sorry. There's a nice passage about the wasteland here somewhere, about the way that this works. Well, I wanted to bring it up mainly because there's a very, very famous poem from the 20th century, the early 20th century, that's called The Wasteland. Anyway, it's got a lot of things going on in it, but one of the things that that poem is about seems to be this same problem of the wounded king and the wounded land, and the way that a lack of leadership or virtue in the society or the country is connected to this sickness or this barrenness in the land itself. It's a really cool idea. It's a really powerful poem by T.S. Eliot, and Eliot's an interesting figure. He goes and lives in England. He becomes essentially a British person, but he's actually American. He's actually born in the U.S. So I always thought that was kind of funny. In growing up, I think I always sort of did think that British authors, were a little better than American authors. So I could sort of empathize with T.S. Eliot in his journey to become a great author. He thought he had to go and live in England, um, but he does have some really interesting religious poems too later on. So he's taking a lot of inspiration from this story of the Grail and the keeper of the Holy Grail being King Pelles. Anyway, mentioned before that Galahad seems to represent faith, and it has to do with his shield. So we see him acquire the sword first thing, sort of cementing his role as the greatest knight. We see him getting the shield here. With the shield comes a whole story, really, of the arrival of the Grail. And so there's this King Mordrain who converts to Christianity, has this shield, and is given it by the keeper of the Grail, the original keeper, Joseph of Arimathea. Then the story goes, they leave that place, Saris, another sort of mythical location. They bring the Grail to Britain. Of course, every good thing has to go to England, like we said. And they bring with it the Christian faith. So the idea that the faith is connected with the shield and, of course, with the Grail, I'm kind of getting that from here. Of course, it's the beginning of spring. We have Easter coming up, which is a pretty major event in the calendar for Christian faith. But we also have St. Patrick's Day this week that's celebrated on Wednesday, I think. So that, too, is actually a sort of story about where a missionary brings the idea of the gospel, the good news, with him into a new and ignorant location. In that case, Ireland. In this case, we're talking about Britain. And for whatever reason, we still celebrate St. Patrick's Day. The other kind of patron saint, of England is St. George, who I think Galahad is also kind of a reflection of. Um, And we see a really great version of that story told um, in uh, sorry, I'm just drawing a blank on it. Man, the poet, boy, uh, the Fairy Queen. Who's the author of the Fairy Queen? Spenser. That's it. So Spenser's Fairy Queen. This is one that is much longer than The Wasteland. Uh, it's much more interested in sort of the specifically the idea of virtue, right, of good character, and how to sort of represent that. Not so much maybe interested in the politics in that case, but again, if you're looking for a challenge, uh, the Fairy Queen I think is even more dense and difficult than the Wasteland. It is also much longer, so that one will keep you busy. But it starts anyway with a version of the George uh, and the Dragon story. So we've got our great knight Galahad. We've got him equipped with his sword, usually connected with this idea of destiny again and his identity. With the shield, connected with this idea of faith. So he's ready to go. He doesn't have a squire, but he doesn't seem to need one. He sends back the person he wants to be his squire. But he does have this interesting habit of sort of going off into his own little world. Um, he seems to really not need other people. He doesn't need a squire. He doesn't need companions. He seems to really sort of exist, at least partly already, in a kind of holy or elevated mood. He doesn't seem like other people. Uh, and so I think I said this last time, but he, for that reason, is a sort of a difficult character to understand. And so maybe it's good that the story doesn't stick too closely to just Galahad. Um, it might be really difficult to get into in that case. So instead, we have someone who's a bit more sympathetic in Lancelot, but also Percival and eventually Bors as well. So these characters kind of help us triangulate on whatever it is about Galahad that makes him special, that we're supposed to admire. Clearly, he is being held up as this figure for us to aspire to be like. And we see that partly through the ways that the other characters fall short. So that's, of course, Lancelot, kind of the main example of this. And it's interesting that Lancelot is not really held responsible so much uh, for being unfaithful in the moment when Galahad is conceived, right? He's his father, and that's sort of a trick that's played on him. So he's not really so much punished for that. And after all, Galahad is great, so it turns out fine. He's really being more punished, or at least he's sort of aware that he has fallen short because he's unfaithful to his king, to Arthur. So it's actually not Elaine, the mother of Galahad, but Guinevere, the wife of Arthur, that Lancelot is he's so in love with her, he's so connected to her that he isn't able to fully devote himself to the quest for the Grail. This is his failure. This is his sort of his downfall. And although he sort of confesses this, we see him make this confession after he realizes that he's fallen short. We see him wearing this hair shirt, so this shirt made of scratchy, coarse hair that is right against his skin and scratches him. He wears this under his armor as a way to show his devotion. Right? Even that is not really enough because in his heart he can't really let go of Guinevere. So we have this kind of classic dilemma where Lancelot is pulled in two different directions, at least. Uh, he wants to be the greatest knight, he wants to be perfect, but he also is in love with Guinevere. In some ways, that makes him a great knight, because that's part of the chivalrous ideal. But when it comes up against a religious sort of idea of perfection, then he is proved to be false to what he should and seems uh, to believe in chastity, to believe in the bonds of matrimony and those being inviolable. So he doesn't really answer this question about he has won her love. It seems clear that she does love him. It seems clear that he's done as much as he can to have that strong bond of love with her. He does get her to let him go, to allow him to go on the quest. But it's unclear whether that was a good thing for him to demand of her in the first place. It's maybe not her place to be able to say whether he should go on this quest or not. It's again a way in which Lancelot seems to really care more about Guinevere than he does about the Grail when all's said and done. And Arthur, well, as we saw, he cares more about his round table, really, than about the Grail. So he too is very much being held back from a true dedication to this search for this quest. Okay, so what about these other two? As you're reading along, you'll eventually come to Percival and Bors, and they have sort of parallel stories. They're each really facing temptations. Um, in Percival's case, he seems to be very innocent. He seems to give his word here really without knowing what he's doing. And this is kind of a classic move we see in epic literature, epic stories like the Greek gods will say, you can ask me anything you want and I'll do it for you. And then they're asked something and they say, oh, I shouldn't have offered that, right? It's kind of a classic fairy tale almost motif that we see here. He says, so this mysterious lady shows up. If you would promise to do my bidding whenever I call on you, I could find you a horse, one that has no equal for fire or beauty or speed of foot. Hope leapt in Percival. As to that, I am a knight, one of Arthur's court, and so sworn to be the true and faithful servant of all women who need my help. So he's not very careful, right? He's sort of, again, the image of hope, maybe a little bit naive in the way that he hopes. And so he says, remember what you promised me. I will remember, said Sir Percival, not at all sure what he had promised. He promised to do anything she asked. And the horse that he gets is this kind of wild, turns out to be essentially a demon that is going to destroy him, except in the last moment he makes the sign of the cross, which apparently dispels this evil magic. And you might be thinking here of Morgan Le Fay. Probably would think of her too when we get to the magic boats. These boats that take us on our adventures. We saw something like that before, and that was her tricking some of the knights, including Arthur, with those the they get on the magic boat and they fall asleep and then they're taken somewhere. Uh, they have to fight each other. So Morgan Le Fay is also sort of absent from this story of the Holy Grail. Rosemary Sutcliff kind of mentions this in her foreword, like the way that the Christian story and the stories of magic fit together is not entirely clear, but they seem to sort of um, occupy the same space. So it's a bit confusing. Um, I don't know if we're supposed to sort of imagine that maybe this is Morgan Le Fay trying to interfere, in this great quest and mess things up for Arthur and his knights once again, or if we're just supposed to say that this is these are demons um, that are strictly within the kind of sphere of religion. I don't know quite how to tell the difference in these cases between magic and something more spiritual. Um, but the role of these temptations is pretty clear. It's to test whether these knights are worthy. So in a way, uh, whether it's Morgan Le Fay or whether it's demonic powers, whatever it is, it's still sort of working within uh, a plan that's supposed to bring us to the Holy Grail, right? To bring the chosen knights to that point and allowing them to prove that they are worthy of this. Um, Now, of course, the way that you prove you're worthy is mostly by trusting, showing faith, showing hope, showing love, and then letting God work in the ways that you can then give thanks for. And if you're Lancelot, again, you're not fully able to do that because you're in love with someone else's wife, right? Your queen happens to be. Uh, Whereas if you're Percival, you sort of are very open and trusting, maybe this comes a little bit more easily to you. Not that it's easy, right? He almost gets killed, but it at least is something he's capable of. And we see this with Percival's sister too, in a big way. Um, so again, speaking of sort of magical moments, but also very strange, very unsettling moments. The role of Percival's sister as the maiden, um, she has to save someone else's life by sacrificing her own, which is a very religious idea, but sort of very literal in a way. It's like really in your face, that that's the level of sacrifice that's required to be successful and to see the Grail, the mystery, and have it make sense. Uh, so Percival's important, really, I think, as a symbol of the kind of attitude that we want to have when we're looking for the Holy Grail. I think the same goes for Bors. Um, Bors is not necessarily such a uh, prominent knight in the rankings, as far as I know, but maybe he's good enough as a fighter anyway, because um, he basically shows another kind of faith, right? Shows that he's trustworthy in this first chapter, and then a bit later, just to jump ahead here, we come back to Bors. A bit of an understatement here. He makes a hard choice. He has to choose between saving his brother Lionel, who is imprisoned and being tortured, or to save a stranger, someone he doesn't know at all, but a maiden, someone who's helpless in the context of this story anyway, being carried off by a strange knight. So Bors makes this hard choice. Um, he's sort of, again, this dilemma that he faces is loyalty to his family, to somebody that he should be sticking by no matter what, his brother, or loyalty to his ideal as a knight, to protect the innocent, to protect those who can't help themselves. And so the story seems to imply that he makes the right decision here. And this is really uh, something that he uh, is rewarded for, because he is going to be one of the three who gets to the Holy Grail. Um, Again, he shows that he's doing this in the right way too. He makes this sort of last minute prayer. You might call it a Hail Mary, right? That God will protect, or Jesus will protect his brother until he can come back. So it's not that he's abandoning his brother, it's that he is leaping, he's making that leap of faith, right, into the fray to save someone else, but trusting that his brother will be okay in the meantime. And there's these kind of weird moments where his temptation is to sort of lose faith, right? To say, that God didn't protect his brother, that he made the right choice and he was not rewarded for it. But of course, those are illusions that are being shown to him. Those are things that are trying to get him to go back um, on his choice, on his leap. Um, but he doesn't. He stands strong. And even when his brother comes after him and tries to take vengeance on him for abandoning him, again, that's his brother misunderstanding what happened in that moment. Um, his brother leaping to a conclusion which doesn't take into account the way that Bors made that prayer, made that choice. Um, and his brother is very much ashamed for the way that he responds here. Um, so again, praying for forgiveness. That's the key sort of move here for these three knights who are going to make the quest come true. And so that's why I guess if I had to assign Bors something, I would actually give him the sort of pride of place here. He seems to represent love, actually, the love of God, not the love necessarily of his family or even of women, or the sort of thing that's holding Lancelot back, but a really pure kind of uh, uh, sort of giving of himself. Um, and I think the sister of Percival shows that very strongly as well. But again, in a way that's very difficult to understand. Um, Even for these chosen knights, the way that she makes her decision is a little bit astonishing to them. And it turns out okay in the end. She does arrive with them to this promised land where the Grail is going to end up. All right, so there's kind of our main characters, a little bit about each of them. We've got, of course, yet another kind of level of setting Galahad apart, though. It's not enough that he gets one sword of destiny that he pulls from a block of marble to sort of outdo Arthur with the sword and the stone. But of course, Arthur himself got a special sword, Excalibur, from the lake. In the same way, Galahad here is going to outdo that too by getting a second sword from a magical ship that shows up to carry them on the last leg of their quest. So this sword is sort of the explanation for that wound that the king, his grandfather, has, and that has also sort of struck his land and made it impossible for the land to support life, right? So apparently his grandfather tried to draw this sword, thinking that he was the chosen knight, but of course his timing was off. He was not the one. Um, yeah, yeah. He rode out hunting one day, became separated from his hounds. There, lying in a deep inlet, he found the ship. He read the words on the side. He was good as any earthly knight. He had faith in God as strong as any other. He knew of no sin he had committed against his God, and so boarded the ship. He found the sword. He unsheathed it by as much as you can see, but before he could draw it completely from the sheath, there came a spear flying out of nowhere and pierced him through the thigh, making a wound which has never healed. So there you go. And the land was wounded, the land in which the waters do not flow. The harvest fails. There, that's the part I was trying to find earlier. I don't know why I wrote that. Oh, maybe that's 137. It's 111. I don't know what I was doing earlier. Anyway, so this is a good description, though, of a kind of pride, maybe like a certain kind of danger that even a very good and faithful knight can fall prey to, of thinking that they're the best, right? And we see throughout that Galahad, although he is the best, is very humble about it. Not he isn't really willing to claim that he is the best knight. Um, Neither of the others is punished for trying to grab the sword, actually, but they do kind of push Galahad to do it. In the same way, we see him pushed to become the king of the magical land of Saris, where the Grail ends up. Um, so Galahad is sort of he's in the position of being the best, everyone knowing he's the best, but never uh, sort of lording it over anybody, never becoming over proud. Uh, so in the end, his humility uh, makes people want him as their king, right? His goodness, his uh, meekness. And in that moment, once he's the king, once the Grail is returned, once everything is sort of at its peak, he even sort of willingly gives up the ghost, right? He lets himself uh, expire, right? Leave the physical world, and he is taken from that land of Saris just very shortly after he arrives there and becomes the king. And so I'm not sure what that says about Arthur. If we're thinking of Galahad sort of being greater than any other knight, so greater than Lancelot, of course, um, but also greater than Arthur, perhaps, and sort of changing the meaning of the Round Table in the way that he does, it might just represent that such a great sort of moment is short-lived. Um, the the attaining of the quest, it does heal the land. So his grandfather's land is restored. It does bring about sort of the promises that were connected with the Holy Grail. Um, but it also is this short moment of perfection. And it means that the round table is never going to be complete again, right? He was the completion. He was the last seat, the dangerous, the perilous seat. And once he's gone, and many other knights don't return, um, Arthur's kingdom is on the decline. So this idea of a kind of perfect kingdom, it seems like an ideal that can only exist in a very brief way, even with the most perfect knight as the king there. There's ultimately, of course, the idea that maybe Arthur will return someday, right? Maybe this is all sort of a rehearsal, right, for the way that things ought to be or should be someday. And we're going to see that idea, I think, in our next book. Um, the third in the series is called The Road to Camlan, the last battle in the Arthur story. And I guess we'll get a little bit more of the kind of human side of this this attempt to make a perfect society. And Galahad, of course, will not be present for that. his role, his sort of model, is in the background, right? And sort of a reminder of all the ways that the other knights have fallen short. We didn't really talk about him, but Gawain is among them. The ways that love and family can lead to more trouble instead of being a kind of jumping off point for that leap of faith. And I have not read yet The Road to Camlan, but again, I think it's going to end similarly, I would guess, to the way that this book ends, which, of course, comes back to Bor's story. So, when Bors was rested, the king sent for his clerks, who had taken down from each returning knight the story of his adventures on the quest. They took down Sir Bors' story, which was the only one that went beyond Sir Launcelot's, and told of the last adventuring of Sir Galahad and Sir Percival and himself, and of the taking up to heaven of the Grail. Then the record was complete, and the king sent it for safekeeping to the monks of the Abbey Library of Salisbury. Then in future years the story of the quest for the Holy Grail might not be lost to men coming after. People, us, right? The readers. So this idea that Bors is the one who's going to tell the story, that's going to keep the story alive, is really, really interesting. Gawain has got the fairy wife for a while, so he's pretty amazing. Lancelot, among the greatest ever knights, and is the father of the greatest knight, and he and Galahad get to hang out for a little while in part of the story. Percival, kind of the ultimate just follower, hope springs eternal for him, right? But again, what Bors brings is the story being passed down, right? So that all of these other stories can sort of get brought together. And Arthur's part of that too, right? He is the record keeper, or he's the one ordering the record keepers, right? And sending this story out there. So I think there might be some redemption for Arthur here. There certainly is for Lancelot and Gawain as well. I'm thinking, of course, of the version of the story that I have read a couple times is T.H. White's, and there's just a really touching moment in there where Gawain writes a letter, and it's sort of his last attempt to make things right. And it's a beautiful, beautiful moment. So I don't know if that moment gets taken from sort of the real story, and if it will make it into Rosemary Sutcliffe's retelling. I'm excited to read The Road to Camlan. I hope you are too. I hope you've had a chance to read The Light Beyond the Forest. I kind of spoiled it, I guess, if you hadn't. So fortunately, with these great stories, you can always read them again and get something more out of it. Again, even if you sort of know how the story goes. So enjoy, keep reading, whether it's The Light Beyond the Forest or The Road to Camlan. That's the one we'll be talking about next time. We've made it beyond the forest. Here we are. And I look forward to talking to you guys in a couple of weeks. That'll be the first Monday in April. Okay, so maybe a little bit longer between this meeting and that one than usual, but I'll see you all there. If you have questions and comments, I do hope you'll send them in. Find us at Signum University's website, the Academy page. We have some clubs starting up as well, so check that out. Send us any comments and questions. Thanks again for your participation, and we'll see you then.